Hello, and welcome to I Am Dad podcast with your fatherhood authority, Kenneth Braswell. 30 minutes of wisdom, information, resources, and nuggets to help you on your fatherhood journey. Or maybe you're just curious and want to hear some real talk about fatherhood, family, and the minds of men. Well, guess what? We got you too. Sit back, grab your pad and pen, and maybe even bring a little something to sip on. Enjoy 30 straight minutes of fatherhood, family, and fun with the Fatherhood Authority, Kenneth Braswell.
Hello and welcome to I Am Dad podcast. I'm your host, Kenneth Braswell. I've been with you now for the last number of Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. in the morning Eastern time. Thank you so much for all of your support, your comments, your followings, your shares, your suggestions on shows and topics that you want to hear, people you want to hear from. And my guest happens to be one of the people that someone specifically, Dr. Edin, said, you got to have her on your show. And your name was already on my list of people to talk to. So I was able to sit back to her. I'm like, nope, she's on my radar. She's always on my radar. And we will see if we can break into her extremely busy schedule to get her on I Am Dad podcast to talk about her work. But for those of you who don't know her, she is the nation's or one of the nation's leading poverty researchers working in the domains of welfare and low-wage work, family life, and neighborhood contexts through direct, in-depth observations of the lives of low-income populations. The hallmark of her research is her direct, in-depth observation. Something that's somewhere in there I kind of doubled something up on. But Dr. Edin is the William Church Osborn Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, the Director of the Center for Research on Child Wellbeing, Princeton University, co-director of the Joint Degree Program in Social Policy, and a Principal Investigator on the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study at Princeton University. She's also on the American Voices Project and Deepening Our Understanding of America's Most Vulnerable. She is the author of 2 books. One I've read, and I read thoroughly, and I enjoyed the way you wrote that book, and that is Doing the Best I Can, Fatherhood in the Intercity. And then she also co-authored a book, I believe in 2017, It's Not Like I'm Poor, How Working Families Make Ends Meet in a Post-Welfare World. How you doing, Dr. Edin?
I'm doing great. I'm really glad to be with you.
Thank you so much. Listen, let's start here. What's keeping you busy? What's keeping you up at nights right now in terms of the work that you're doing?
You know, it's kind of exciting. We're learning things about fathers, I think, that really confirm many of the themes that you and I have been talking about for many years. And this is new work from the survey. So mostly I'm a neighborhood, go out and talk to them sort of researcher, but I also run a large population-based survey that has one of the largest samples of fathers, particularly disadvantaged fathers in the country. And what we're learning most recently from those survey data, and again, this confirms much of what you've been telling people for a long time, is that fathers really do matter. The young people in the study are now 22. When we look at what leads to positive adolescent outcomes, involvement with dad is big. So very, very consequential. Many times there are stepdads in the picture now. Stepdads are also really consequential, and dads and stepdads don't compete, they complement.
Got you.
So this is very different from what we had known before from older studies. It seems like fathers are figuring it out, and they're figuring out how to father in complementary ways rather than competitive ways. This is a real breakthrough. Finally, dads are coming back around. So sometimes, their dads have been excluded from their children's lives due to incarceration, due to addiction, sometimes due to maternal gatekeeping. And once the kids get old enough for the dads to have direct contact with their children, they pursue that. So we're seeing in adolescence dads coming back and re-engaging, even if they've spent years not being able to engage with their children. So those are some of the really the findings that I'm really excited about.
Wow. I'm glad you said a couple of things, because there's, I think one of the things I'm excited about in this space is that we're beginning to connect the dots. I think for so many years, many people have been charged with defining the dot, and no one has been out there connecting the dots. And I think with the writing of your books and things like these podcasts and conferences and new people, social media coming into the space, right? That we're beginning to kind of make a little bit of sense out of really what's happening out there, and to begin to tell a different narrative. You said something that really struck my heart. It's something that we talk to. I have a training that I do called Standing in the Gap, Single Moms Raising Boys. And every time I start that training off, I always say to them, you don't have the only perspective of being a single mom. I have one too. I was raised by one, so I could tell you some things about you that you don't even know from the vantage point of a little boy being raised by a single mom. And you could always kind of see their wheels begin to turn when you kind of hit them with something that allows them to expand their narrative. And then I start out with these two conversational starters that they have to agree to before we move forward. The first one is, for every single mom, there is a single dad. And you should see the way that they look at me. And I said, no. I said, the term single mom doesn't denote parenting status, it denotes marital status. So if
That's right.
a single mom, there is a single dad. The connotation of the word single mom has just been built to mean many other things to many other people, but in the essence of it, for every single mom, there's a single dad. And it takes them a minute to get to it, and then they're like, okay, I'm with you. I could go with that one. And then the second one is what you just said, which is a dad can be compensated for but not replaced. And the
Correct.
realities of that inability to replace is the hole in that child's heart left by the absence of their father. So no matter who steps in to compensate for that hole still exists, and they still yearn to want to know and understand everything they can possibly understand about that father who was supposed to be there to fill that hole for them. What I want you to talk a little bit about, because I went to the website, and the website, I think for most people could be overwhelming, but it's really important for folks to understand the importance of the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing study. What is it, and what was it built to accomplish?
So back 25 years ago, we couldn't really tell a story about single parents and their children because our national data sets didn't have enough single parents to be able to build a portrait, especially, taking into account racial and ethnic differences in area of the country, differences in religious views. So Sarah McClanahan, who just passed this last year, the founder of the study, Irv Garfinkel, and Ron Mincy, both from Columbia University, they built a study that began in 2000, and it oversampled single mothers, or as we began calling them, non-marital births, right? Because and we did this in cities across the United States. We were in the hospitals. I don't even know if HIPAA would let you do this stuff. We were in the hospitals watching these children being born, and then we would interview the mother and the father. And one of the first really surprising things is, people said, oh, the dads won't come. You won't be able to get the dads. Well, the dads came. In almost every case, a father was there, and we were able to interview that father. And for those who didn't come, we went after them later through contact information from the mother. A second really striking thing was that half of the couples were living together. So, and 85% rated their chances of staying together as high. Now, many of those couples subsequently broke up. These were relatively young parents at that time in 2000. The average age of childbirth was, 21 for women, 23 for men in this population of people who were not legally married at the time of the child's birth. And then we followed them ever since. We followed the moms, we followed the dads, and we followed the children. And now the children are 22, having their own children. So I'll tell you, I assumed leadership of this study with Jane Waldfogel from Columbia just a couple of years ago. But one thing I think we've learned is that fragile families, the phrase is a misnomer. These families, and then the reason, of course, the study was named Fragile Families was because they wanted to emphasize, the study's authors wanted to emphasize they were families. We thought the fathers had selfishly fled the scene, but they were there. So they wanted to emphasize, yes, this is a family, although fragile because many of them do break up. But now what we've learned is how resilient these families are. Men, both of mothers and fathers, are finding stability either as singles or in subsequent relationship. At the beginning, we saw a lot of churning. Of course, college students at Princeton do churning too. Young adults, in our world do churning. The difference is that these young people were churning while having children. Whereas, the age of first childbirth for college educated young people is much older. So there's a lot of churning and a lot of instability in kids' lives. But as the kids reach 9 and particularly 15, we really see families figuring it out. Now, I will say there's one troubling thing, and that is when young people get attached to their fathers and their fathers leave for a time, usually because of incarceration and addiction, sometimes because moms are actively keeping them out for good and bad reasons. Not all good, but not all bad. The kids are bitter. This really, as you said, you can't replace a dad, and they're really bitter. And sometimes when their dads reconnect, they're extremely critical of their dads, at least at first. I mean, I would say to dads out there, keep trying, because many of the dads are able to eventually reconnect, but there's a lot of anger. And this even happens in cases where the father has been separated due to incarceration. So the kids don't give the dads a break. You know how teenagers are? They don't give their parents a break. And so we are seeing, young people saying, hey, you got to earn the title of dad. I'm not going to just give you that title. And I think part of this is in mass incarceration policy, criminal justice. This has really hurt our families in ways that are really palpable in the narratives of young adolescents and young adults. And ineffective responses to addiction. Our public health response to addiction is deplorable, and especially if you don't have a lot of economic resources.
Right.
So the decisions that we make about how we treat men in their family building years really have consequences that echo. So oftentimes when a dad says, I want to reconnect with my 15-year-old, he's going to be put through his paces, right? And so it takes a tremendous amount of persistence and perseverance and humility to to make that connection. Dads are doing it, but it's not easy.
Yeah, you said something that struck me. One of my interviews I just did, and in fact, it just aired this weekend, was with Ron Tiarina of the Ridge Project in Ohio. And he tells the story of coming home from incarceration and having to go through what he describes as a man battle with his son,
Yeah.
who assumed the position of man of the house while he was incarcerated, and wanted to come home. And when he got home, his son wasn't ready to give up that position. In his physical manifestation, it took place at the kitchen table where his son sat at the head of the table. And when he came
Wow.
home, he wouldn't give up that seat to his dad. And it took a minute for Ron to figure out what to say to him, to get him to relinquish having to feel like he had to hold on to this role. And he did that by apologizing to him for putting him in the position of having to be the man of the family. And that was my responsibility, and I apologize for that. But now I want to give you back something that I took away from you, and that is to allow you to be a child. You
Oh
need
my
to
goodness.
be a child. It's just every time I hear Ron and Kathy tell that story, it breaks me down. But what
Yeah.
you just described is that in real time for these dads
Yes.
who come back and what that looks like. The other question I was going to ask you as you talk about these children coming into year 23 of their lives is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And I wonder whether or not you and your colleagues are kind of thinking about the intergenerational difference of these children based on previous generations. Because what you're describing and talking about is these new generation Zers, right? And I got two in my house. I have a 13-year-old boy and a 15-year-old nephew in my house, and they're next level kids. They're nothing like any of my other kids. They are very, very different in a lot of different ways. And I always describe them based on how the descriptor of Generation Zers are right now. But the two attributes is, one is that they have absolutely no fear of authority. And number two is that they are intimately and intricately connected to technology, meaning that if you take away their technology, they struggle with being, that all of their who they are to the world and who they are to their friends are manifest through technology. As you're looking at the characteristics of these children that are being raised, are you seeing generational differences between them and their parents and previous generations?
Yeah. So that's one really huge advantage of the Fragile Family Study. Once we hit age 22, we were interviewing the children at exactly the same age that the parents were when they had them. And now, of course, we're planning for year 27. So we're really one of our main goals in the study now is to look at that intergenerational persistence. But I can tell you one difference we have a lot of data from, not only from Fragile Families, but work we've been doing with it's a random sample of young people who came of age in Baltimore. They were all raised in Baltimore public housing, and we've been following them for many years. And the girls have changed more than the boys, at least according to the data we have. So if you talk to and I've been talking to mothers for years and years, I was slow to come to the fatherhood work. And it was really good that I did, because I definitely had to revise many of my views. But the girls are saying to us, I don't want to have a baby till I'm 30. I have all these goals and I have all these plans. They really they're sounding like, well, when I talk to their mothers, and of course I did talk to their mothers in that first wave of the Fragile Family Study. I followed 75 of the moms and the dads. women were much more focused on children as a key source of meaning and identity. And I would say among this generation, they're really focused on career entry. They also really look at the 20s as a time of exploration, not in the way the middle class, it's not the expedited, or it's not the, the long winding path that middle class kids are taking now. They're becoming adults around 30. But they, they aspire to having that time to explore. However, reality, especially among low-income kids, sets in quickly, and they end up sort of shortchanging those dreams. So they have big dreams, vocationally in particular. But then the one woman who wants to be a nurse is a nurse's aide, and so there's this sort of this push into adulthood, really by virtue of economic necessity and the need to move out of the household of origin because of overcrowding and so on. That it's an interesting portrait of the moms. That they're really sounding very career oriented, but they're dating. They're dating. Or
oh my goodness, it's so interesting that you speaking my truth right now. And so I have, of my 4 girls, my 2 youngest ones, and Zinga, who's 23, went to 1 year of college and dropped out to pursue her entrepreneurship dreams.
Yes.
And
Yes,
my
I
other
believe that.
one, who is 26 years old, single, no children, and she's just living her best life. And I'm so envious of her. It's like every time I talk to her, it's like, Dad, I'm going to Cancun this weekend. And she works, she saves her money, and she goes on vacations, and she's uninhibited. And I'm like, oh my goodness, man, I wish I was able to do that at your age and not have to worry about being a dad and being responsible and having a job and doing those things. And my boys coming up behind her has the same exact spirit. Like, family is not part of their trajectory. It often makes me think about, and you've heard this, and I heard somebody mention it the other day, and there's always conversation around its relevancy, this whole notion of success sequence, right? Children going to college, getting their degree, coming home, getting a job, finding their soulmate, getting a house, then having a baby. Like, that is thrown all the way out the door.
It is.
Children are not thinking that way. And they're really beginning, to your point, think about how they're going to build and structure their own lives before they begin to start thinking about how to build it collectively with someone else.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So the last time we talked face to face with the Fragile Families young people, they were 19. I mean, we were surveying them, but we go out and talk to them as well. And I think the boys are a little more lost. They still a lot of starting and stopping. We know this from educational research, but a lot of starting and stopping, especially that first year of post-secondary education is really tough. It's still very tough, even if you're a high school graduate, no criminal record, to find full-time stable work. As manufacturing has declined, it is just very, very hard. And a lot of young people are turning in the, they're in school. Most of them go to school. They try post-secondary education, but they end up churning and racking up debt. And many times they do so in the face of these privately owned for-profit schools. So in the Baltimore sample, 70% of the kids enrolled in one of these schools. And, they sign up to be an HVAC repair person, and they don't know what that is. And they suddenly walk by a phlebotomy class and they think, oh, I want to do that. And then it turns out they get the phlebotomy degree and they can't find a job that pays more than $16 an hour, 20 hours a week. And so they're churning in this this period where middle class kids are sort of you know, going to college, going for 4 years. Maybe they're dropping out, your daughter to pursue something more creative than the standard path. But I think less educated or less advantaged young people, especially the boys, are really having a hard time getting a foothold in this economy.
I know you are paying attention to the work that particularly the government is putting into responsible fatherhood and income supports for low-income families and moms and those kinds of things. I remember, as I'm sure you do, in the first iteration of grants that went out for responsible fatherhood, there was a heavy emphasis on the demand of including DV before you began to do responsible fatherhood work. And then in the next iteration, there was a shift from DV to child support. And then in the next iteration, a shift from child support to workforce development. And now in this latest iteration, a shift from workforce development to soft skills and training and co-parenting and relationship. From your vantage point, in terms of what you're seeing in your space of research and how the federal government is aligning programs with trying to serve these folks on the ground, what are we missing? Why is it that we have not been able to find the holy grail of programs to ensure that these individuals are healthy in the lives of their children?
Well, I have two responses. One is that we've actually never had evidence, even from the Building Strong Families programs, that more contact led to more domestic violence. That's the story we tell ourselves to justify excluded men. And, the men in question are disproportionately Black and brown. So there's a lot of prejudice still against Black and brown people, but maybe particularly this image of the predatory Black and brown man, Black or brown man, is just really salient in our culture. And so we see that manifest in this whole domestic violence narrative, despite a lack of evidence to the contrary. And by the way, the domestic violence training that goes on in these programs is good. We could all learn those skills. So it's not to say that that's bad, but we could probably all benefit, not just people in fatherhood programs. So my assessment is that we're sort of telling ourselves a big lie about the situation these fathers are in. Many of them have been formerly incarcerated or suffered with addiction. They've been exposed to violence, and it's trauma, right? Many have experienced childhood trauma as well. Then, in many cases, they've been separated from their child for a time, as I said before. And the child support system, it's really broken. We need it. It's the biggest anti-poverty program, except tax credits, that we have. But it's really broken, especially in the way it treats unmarried men who get no rights in most states to visitation or decision-making over the child, but are often levied up to 65% of their income in order to pay child support. I've written about this extensively, but we're putting people in a situation where they cannot succeed. There was a really neat experiment in San Francisco child support, where fathers were, and then of course there are the issue of arrears, especially government-owned arrears, but arrears more generally, which are crippling because these awards are so high. So, by the way, middle-class men only pay about 20% of their income in child support. So this is really unfair. But what this little experiment did is a private foundation paid to forgive the debt, all the arrears of dads who would stay current on, with the understanding the dads would stay then current on their child support. And we went out and interviewed these men, and it was like a death to life narrative. You know, because they were debt free, they were no longer paying that 65%, but were paying at a more reasonable level. They were using the money to take their kids to Fisherman's Wharf and to go on special outings to buy school supplies. They were seeing their kids more. It was just, you know, such a parable of what we could do if we actually extended dignity and respect to these men in the same way that we do to other people in society who can claim more privileges.
Wow.
So I think the problems are really of our own making. We've stigmatized and excluded a group of people. We've put them through hell. And we've subjected them to rules that don't apply to more privileged people. And then we say, what's wrong? What's wrong with this intervention? Why isn't it working? Well, what is amazing though is how many dads persevere despite that. And you know, we should really be in awe of these fathers.
Yeah, I think one of the good things is when, you know, as I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about, so we have a fire grant here in Atlanta, and we created what we call a Gentle Warriors Academy. So
I love the
yeah,
name.
thank you. I've really been able to take these multiplicity of years of things that I've learned in my other spaces, whether it was heading the New York State Fatherhood Initiative or my current role overseeing the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse and providing TA and talking to countless people across the country and having great minds like you kind of feed me a little bit, you know, real information and real thought. And I poured all of that into Gentle Warriors Academy to try to create a model. And we are doing so well. You know, each year we have now been about between 150 and 160% over our goals for serving men.
Wow.
And on our Facebook page, we created specifically for dads in the Metro Atlanta area. We're now approaching like 3,600 dads on that page, and they're dialoguing and conversating, and we're moving around. And one of the things that I'm learning now that I'm back on the ground, because I resisted that work so vehemently over my course of my year, because I've been there, done that. I wanted to be in the technical assistant professional development space and not in the direct service. But here I am in Atlanta providing direct service. But as I listen to the voices of all of these men that come through our space, we just did a graduation a week ago with 50 fathers. And we have a partnership now with Morehouse College where we're doing our graduations on the campus of Morehouse.
Oh, I love that. That's powerful.
Thank you. To connect these mostly African-American dads to the institution that is known around the country for educating Black fathers, Black men in this country, and trying to make that connect to them. But in Georgia, I don't know if you know, one of the biggest issues that we're trying to figure out how to interact and engage and impact this particular policy is this policy of legitimation. So in the state of Georgia, if you are unmarried, and we're the only state in the country that has this two process for legal access to your children. If you are unmarried at the birth of your child, you have no legal rights to your child in the state of Georgia. You can be deemed a father through paternity and child support can come at you, but you cannot apply for custody and parenting time because you don't have legal access to their child. And there's a whole other host of things that happens around that. And there was a young lady, Dr. Chalonda Smith, that did her dissertation on legitimation and found that as it relates to child support, that that fathers are less likely to pay child support when they do not have custody or parenting time.
Yes.
And less likely if they have custody and no parenting time. but more likely to pay child support if they have both. And so when you talk to these fathers, to your point about those things that really matter to them, it's not the money. The money doesn't matter. If they have the means to pay child support, they will, but they struggle with doing that when you, on the backhand side, say to them they don't have access, legal access to their children. And it's just something that it seems and sounds, barbaric, in the sense that you would hold people's children, but it's a law that's been on the books for 100 years, and no one has taken up the mantle to begin to get it off the books. And what we're learning now is over the last 10 years, close to 560,000 children in the state of Georgia have been born without legitimate fathers in their lives, and no one seems to understand the damage that that's doing to dads.
I so agree with you. It's I was going to say something about this about fatherhood programs. One thing I think that's hampered our creativity in this space, and I think you've just given a really great example of how sometimes we're tasked with direct service, and we don't have the bandwidth for the advocacy that's needed to really make the systemic change. The change. There's people who are working so hard in the space, but how do you? I'm most familiar, of course, with Center for Urban Families in Baltimore, where I do some volunteer. How do you lift your head up out of the tunnel of providing direct service to try to get a law like that off the books? The fathers I talk to call that, taxation without representation. They really, rail against this. But the people who perpetuate these systems need to be convinced that, caring and paying go together. And if you want to improve child support, improve visitation, we have so much research showing that's true. So I wonder sometimes if we as a society aren't more intent on punishing. Like, do we really care about kids? If we did, right? Do we really care about child well-being? This is a win-win. Right. It's a win-win. And so I sometimes wonder, are we is our social ethos more about punishing a group of men because of an old narrative, really, that you can trace back to the 1950s about single parents, other parents having deserted the family. We used to call these men deserters. There was no thought that they would want to be involved. Right. So we're still stuck with this old narrative, and what we're doing does not make sense, because children will be better off, both financially and emotionally. And we know the mom is not going to be at greater risk in most cases, as long as we keep taking precautions to make sure that everyone in our society knows what a healthy relationship is.
As we round to a close, Dr. Edin, I want to get your thoughts on the increasing conversation around trauma-informed care and this conversation around mental health, particularly as it relates to low-income parents, and more specifically as it relates to fatherhood and fathers of color. And so I'm actually working on the outline of a book now that I've been wanting to pen for a while, and I just haven't had a chance to get to it. But the title of the book is "Why Does Poverty Look Like Me?"
Ooh, wow.
With an exploration on how, when you describe and define what poverty looks like or what poverty is, why does that picture continue to look like me when the descriptor of poverty is colorless? At least that's what people try to make you believe. And the whole notion of the mental health space and how people are functioning given the last 2.5 years of COVID and dramatically having to shift how we do business, how we live, how we work, which is a whole study I'm sure you guys are going to pounce all over,
Yeah.
10 years from now, when you see the impact that COVID had on parenting styles and the way fathers stepped up and the way moms and dads came together and how we co-parented. And then the political turmoil and all that lended to the conversation in America as well, and how people kind of walk through that. But when you look at the mental health aspect of the work that you're doing, how do you include that in your conversation and in the work that you do?
I just, I'm about to finish a book called The Injustice of Place, which really takes a look at these issues from a deeply historical perspective. And trauma goes way back, right? The very same people who the poverty looks like me people are the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of people in our society that have been subjugated to an almost unbelievable degree, exposed to near starvation during seasons of the year when there were no crops to put in the soil or to harvest, denied basic human rights for everything from voting to access to unemployment insurance. Were exposed to schools that didn't even attempt to teach people to get ahead, because what you wanted was a maintenance of the supply of cheap labor that kept the economy going for the haves. So so if you bring that all forward, and I have found in my not in my historical work, but in my more contemporary work, that if you really talk to people about their life histories, trauma is everywhere. We were in Chicago this summer interviewing young adult men who are part of an anti-violence program. And sometimes the stories were so painful, the men literally couldn't tell us their life story. It was too hard for them to go back there and relive it in a conversation. This is, this is a result of the decisions we've made, right? So in the case of Chicago, you have people coming up from Mississippi and Alabama, very traumatic. You have Puerto Rican and Mexican populations, some of the Mexican Americans coming up from South Texas, which had, very similar labor relations as did the Deep South, but maybe to a lesser degree because there was no history of enslavement. So all of this comes together, and you put people in segregated neighborhoods, deeply unequal schools. A lot happens to kids. You stress parents out, since we decided that, in the 90s that even mothers of very young children should work. Often in order to make it in this economy, that means working 2 jobs. Who takes care of the kids? Who protects? Right? If you're moving in and out of, you're churning between relationships and you're churning between houses, every move exposes your children to risk.
Absolutely.
So most middle-class people have no idea. Our students are coming to terms with mental health here at Princeton. And which is really important. And I just applaud them and their courage and their self-advocacy. But we don't have the spaces for that we need to for non-affluent people.
Yeah, one of the fights that I was going to pick up, and I picked it up and then I put it back down, but it's on my shelf. At some point, I'm going to pick it back up. And that is to encourage SAMHSA to add fatherlessness as one of their ACEs. I think that fatherlessness is an ACE around adverse childhood experiences that should be explored deeper. I know they have something in there about incarceration and also separated parents, but to me, those two things are different than
Right.
fatherlessness, that there's a conversation that needs to be had around how that experience in and of itself impacts our children, and also impacts the mental health of not only our children, but of the parents and the communities to which they live. I picked it up
Yeah.
some time ago. I had some traction and then I got distracted by something and I never picked it back up, but it is something that I want to jump back in to. You are so awesome, Dr. Edin. I don't know if anybody ever
So
tells
are
you that.
you.
You are. I just absolutely love everything about you, all the work you've done. I've followed you from years and years. Dr. Mincy has always spoken extremely highly of you, and he was the first one who told me about you, and I began to just start following your work and trying to include you on every dialogue that I have around the country. I think your work is critical, and I want to find ways for us to be more closely aligned so that I can share with you some of the things, particularly that we're learning around the country, and more specifically here in Atlanta, through our direct service work. And also at some point want to follow you and talk to you a little bit about something that we created 2 years ago that we're also beginning to gain some traction in, and that is we created within Fathers Incorporated the Moynihan Institute for Fatherhood Research and Policy.
I love it.
That focuses directly on Black fathers and their families. And we use the Moynihan Report as the foundation of where we begin our research, not as a honor of Senator Moynihan. It has absolutely nothing to do with him. It has to do with the report that creates the research foundation for us to build from and to begin to start writing the right narrative about what's happening with particularly Black fathers around the country. Tell us how we can get in touch with you, how we can get your books, about anything that you want us to know, so that I can make sure that people find out more about you.
Well, you can find me on email, kedin@princeton.edu. I directed the Center for Research on Child Wellbeing, which hosts the Fragile Family Study. And if you want to know about the research on any topic with regard to fathers, you can go right to our website and see what's been published. And you can, and we do have quite a lot of things on systems involvement with our young people. So this is sort of the precursor to incarceration, right? Is the systems involvement that can start really young and be very consequential. So that's kind of a new emphasis of our center. I've got a couple of websites. We've still got doingthebestican.com up for our fatherhood work. And at the center, we're beginning to do fatherhood work first locally in the state of New Jersey, but we intend to extend that work as we learn lessons from how to do the kind of advocacy you've been doing for many years. So we should definitely join forces. And I always love talking with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all of you who joined I Am Dad podcast today. My guest today, Dr. Kathryn Edin. She is an awesome individual. Please Google her, as the young folks say, and find out about her and her work. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see each and every one of you next Sunday morning, same time, same place. Have a great week.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. You've been listening to I Am Dad podcast. We hope that you have been informed, encouraged you to think, or even inspired your heart for the love of dads. The conversation does not end here. Come back and join us next week. Same time, same place. Or you can continue the dialogue on our I Am Dad Facebook page. We also invite you to listen to past episodes, learn more about us, and keep up with special activities by visiting iamdadpodcast.com. That's iamdadpodcast.com. Until next time, I leave you with this reminder of manhood from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Because of this reminder, I will always understand that I am dad, period.